Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. We're going to give it a couple more minutes for people to show up here today to talk about JavaScript. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about new things in JavaScript since 2015. There's been a lot of activity with JavaScript. And if you're using newer JavaScript frameworks, you may have noticed that JavaScript has changed an awful lot lately. So I'm going to go over some of the brand new things in JavaScript, some of the up and coming things in JavaScript, and just demo some stuff and show you how it all works. But before we get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and about Wintellect. Since you're here, I assume you're somewhat familiar with Wintellect, but you may only be familiar with one of the things Wintellect does. Wintellect is known for consulting and training. And we have instructor-led training as well as on-demand training through Wintellect Now, which is our online subscription-based video service. Wintellect is a Microsoft Gold certified partner and has been Microsoft's #1 training vendor for over 15 years. In addition to our expertise with .NET and Windows, we also have expertise in many other areas like cloud, DevOps, data, artificial intelligence, and web and mobile. And I'm going to be talking about web today. Wintellect's founders are industry influencers and have written over 30 books combined. And we have some special offers for attendees of this webinar. I'm not going to address this in detail right now, but for those in the audience that stay to the end, we'll have some free services and discounts that you can take advantage of if you're interested. I'll show this again at the end of the webinar. I'm Chris Minnick. I'm an author and trainer. I specialize in web and mobile web development. I've written several books, including JavaScript for Dummies, HTML and CSS for Dummies, JavaScript for Kids, and around 10 others. I have 20 years of experience as a full-stack web developer, meaning that I do both server-side as well as client-side development. And I've been a trainer for over 10 years. I'm currently specializing in JavaScript frameworks, React and Vue in particular right now. So I want to talk a little bit before I get started into what's new with JavaScript about how we got to where we are with JavaScript. JavaScript was created originally by Netscape, by Brandon Ike at Netscape in 1995. It was named Mocha at the time, but because Java was so hot at the time, it was renamed to JavaScript as sort of a marketing device. It's kind of an unfortunate choice because now there's a lot of confusion over the difference between Java and JavaScript, but you should just remember that they're totally different things. JavaScript was standardized by ECMA International as ECMAScript around 1996. And JavaScript is currently the most well-known implementation of ECMAScript. So there's a lot of confusion sometimes about the difference between ECMAScript and JavaScript. JavaScript is just an implementation of ECMAScript. ECMAScript 3 was released in 1999. And then we had a long dry period where Microsoft had different ideas about what the future of JavaScript should look like than everyone else, and so there was a lot of disagreement about what ECMAScript 4 should be. And the proposals were eventually dropped, but in the meantime, we had a JavaScript revolution that happened in 2005 when people figured out that you could use JavaScript to load data in the background on a web page, which led to Ajax, and at the same time, jQuery was created, which bridged the gap between Microsoft's implementation of JavaScript and everyone else's and allowed us to start doing some really cool stuff without having to worry so much about cross-browser compatibility when it came to JavaScript. Finally, in 2009, we got some agreement between the different parties that were involved with JavaScript, and JavaScript 3.1 was renamed to ECMAScript 5 and then standardized a couple of years later with ECMAScript 5.1, which is was where the JavaScript world agreed on this harmony plan, and suddenly everyone was united, and we could finally move forward and make some progress. 5.1 is still sort of the baseline version of JavaScript. It's supported by every browser that's currently in use, but by 2015, we were able to move forward and develop ES6, which was later renamed to ES 2015. And with ES6, we suddenly had a lot of new capabilities and features that we didn't have previously. And this is the main thing that I'm going to be talking about in this webinar. So I'm not sure why that looks like that. Okay, so the problem, although we now have agreement on what JavaScript is, browsers are adopting new JavaScript versions at different times, and some people aren't using the latest versions of JavaScript either. So this was a problem we had to overcome so that we could start using all this cool new stuff that's being given to us in ES6 and the further versions that are coming out now. And so the question is, how can you use new JavaScript features today if they're not always supported by every browser or every JavaScript engine that's out there? And the answer is to write using all this new JavaScript syntax, but then convert it to equivalent code in a version of JavaScript that every browser can understand, namely ECMAScript 5.1. We call this process transpiling. The definition of transpile is to take source code written in one language and transform it into another language with a similar level of abstraction. And the tool that we use to do this is Babel. Babel takes your ES6 plus code and translates it into its equivalent ES5 so that it will run in today's browsers. And you can use Babel online. You can go to babeljs.io and type in ES6 code and have it converted into ES5 code. But most of the time, where we use Babel is as a preprocessor during the build process. You can integrate it with your task manager or Webpack, and it will just do its magic. And then what you deploy is the transpiled code built with Babel. Eventually, we won't need Babel, or at least we won't need Babel for ES6 code. We're getting to the point now where modern browsers have pretty good support for ES6, but we also have new features coming into JavaScript every single year now. And so the need for Babel for this ES6 code that I'm going to be showing you today is getting to be less and less, but it's still probably going to be useful if you really want to use the very latest features. And so in ES6, or also known as ES 2015, we got a lot of new features that we've been waiting for a long time, including arrow functions, classes, block-scoped binding, constructs, iterators, modules, promises. And we also have a new version of ES6, of ECMAScript, being released every year now with new features. And I'm going to go over these in brief in the upcoming slides, but at first I wanted to do a quick poll and just see where you are with regards to JavaScript. So I'm going to launch this poll, and if you just take a second and take this, let me know how you would self-rank yourself in this. Okay, great. It looks like we have a lot of people who are JavaScript beginners, about a quarter of you are, or maybe a 20% of you are up to date with ES6. This is about what I expected. So let's move on, and I'm going to attempt to cover everything. I hopefully will have a little time at the end for questions, but there is a lot of material here, and I'm sure that everyone here is going to learn a lot from this. And so after ES 2015, we have new versions coming out every year, as I mentioned. In ES 2016, we had the exponentiation operator, and we got array.includes. In ES 2017, we got async await. In 2018, we got rest spread properties, asynchronous iteration, some improvements to regular expressions. 2019, we're going to be getting array prototype, and this actually is a typo here, so I'm going to fix that really quick. That should say flat and flat map. So we have array.flat and array.flatMap. We have object from entries, and then in next year there's going to be another version, ES 2020, which will have additional features, and maybe I'll do another webinar at that point to talk about those. Before I move on to talking about these new features of JavaScript, I think it's really important that I cover some of the critical but often misunderstood JavaScript concepts. These are things that I see quite a bit where people's misunderstandings about how these things work cause them to make mistakes or to not be able to grasp certain other concepts in JavaScript. So the first one is that JavaScript is prototype based. What this means is that everything in JavaScript, every object in JavaScript is a copy of another object. JavaScript doesn't have classes like you might find or you find in Java and C languages. It has just objects. Each object, though, has a private property that holds a link to its prototype. And then that prototype has a property that links to its prototype, and so forth and so on, all the way back up to the object, which has null as its prototype, and null has no prototype. JavaScript objects are just bags of properties, and a JavaScript object's properties it has inside of itself are called its own properties. So setting a property to an object creates an own property, and when you try to access a property of an object, the property will also be sought on the prototype, that prototype's prototype, and so forth, all the way up the chain until you get to null. Methods in JavaScript are just properties with functions as values. Any function can be added as a property. An inherited function acts just like any other property, including what we call property shadowing. With regards to methods, that's just a form of method overriding. And so I'm going to show a quick demo here about all of this. Oops. And I'm using Visual Studio Code here, and I'm also using an extension called Quokka, which actually executes the commands inside of the editor here as I'm writing them. And this is a really good tool for just demoing things and trying stuff out. So here I've created a function called f that has property this.a and a property this.b, and I've given them values. And then I've created a new object by using this, this is actually a constructor function. So I've used this constructor function f to create a new object o. And then I can assign values to the original prototype object using the prototype keyword here. So I'm setting f.prototype.b to 3 and f.c to 4. Now if I log out o.a, then I get 1 because it goes up to the prototype. So from o here, or actually O has the property O.A because there's a copy of this, is made from this. And then O.B is 2 because it has this dot B from the original constructor. O.C is defined right here when we set the prototype's value to C. So that is equal to 4. And then O.D is undefined. And so what it did here to find this is that it goes to the O object we created and says, okay, there's no D property there. And then it goes to the prototype and there's no D property there. So it goes to object and that doesn't have a D property either. So it returns undefined. And then here we have an example of an object with 2 properties. We have A, which is has a value of 2, and M, which is a method. So it's set equal to a function, returns this dot A plus 1. And so if I log that, then log the running of that function, the result is 3. So I can actually comment it out and then uncommented it runs, and then the Quokka extension here will just show me what the answer is. I can create another instance of this object by using object.create. So in this case, this is going to take the obj object right here and just use it as the prototype to create a new object called P. And then if I do P.A equals 4, that's going to set the value of A on my new object. And then when I run this function, I'll get 5 back because it's doing this dot A, which is now equal to 5, equal to 4 plus 1. Now if I log out obj, I still get 3 because the original prototype object still has its value of 2 for A. All right. So now let's take a look at the next thing I want to talk about is this. There's a lot of misunderstanding in JavaScript about how this works and how you bind this and what it actually means. And the point of this is to allow functions to be reused within different contexts. And the value of this depends on what object is focal when invoking a function. And there are 4 rules to this. There's implicit binding, explicit binding, new binding, and window binding. This depends on when the function was invoked, and we don't know what this is actually until the function's invoked. So let's talk about each of those different kinds of binding: explicit, implicit, window, and new binding one by one. And I'll demonstrate these as well. This refers to the object to the left of the dot. So in implicit binding. So here we have an object, author, that has several properties, 2 properties, and 1 property that is a function. And if we call author.logname, then that's going to run the logname function with the context of author because logname is part of the author object. So if I go back to my editor, you can see right here I have that object. And when I run this, it returns Chris because this .name is inside of the author object that I'm calling here by name. And so that is implicit binding. Problem with implicit binding is that the function can only be used with the context of that particular object. So explicit binding allows you to use functions with different contexts. And there are 3 different methods that can be used with explicit binding: call, apply, and bind. The simplest way to do it is to use call just as I'm doing in this case right here, where you use the function and then use call and you bind it to the function. So right here, we have our function and it has this.f name. Right now, just by itself, until this function actually is called, this has no meaning. Here's our author object, and then if we do logname.callAuthor, then that binds the function logname to the object author, and the console log here returns Chris because this.f name is Chris. So call calls a function with a given this value and the arguments given individually. In that last example, we just passed in the object. In this one here, we're actually passing in one variable. So we have this array language, and we're taking the first element of that array and passing it into call as the second parameter. And what that's going to do is take JavaScript here and pass it in to the function. And then this is going to return this.f name, so author.f name and author.l name, and then the one parameter that's passed in. Just like that. So there's the response. The apply method calls a function with a given this value and the arguments given as an array. So this is basically the same as the call function, but the second argument is an array. So here we have our favorite foods array, and we have an object, and we're passing the context in, it's the first parameter, and then the array. So right here is my function. It takes 3 arguments, and then an array that has 3 elements, and I'm doing logname.apply, author, passed in, and then favorite foods. And this is the array, which will get split up into the 3 parameters. Bind is used extensively in new JavaScript frameworks that use modules and components. It's especially React. You'll see bind used in React, and you'll need to use bind in React all the time. So the point of bind is to return a new function rather than immediately invoking the function. So what you'll see in React is you'll see a component where you define a function inside that component, and then you bind that function to the component so that you can take that function and pass it to a subcomponent, but still have it operate on the parent component. So let me show you a demo here of how bind works. So right here I have logname, which is a function that takes 1 parameter, and I have an object called person, and then I'm using logname.bind to associate logname with the person object and to pass in tacos as a parameter. I'm taking all of that and assigning it to logme, and that actually creates a new function called logme. And every time you run that function, it's going to call logname with this context and with that parameter. So let's try it out, and there's the result right there. New binding is when a function is invoked with the new keyword. Then this keyword is inside of the object is bound to the new object. So city in this case is a constructor function which creates objects when you use it with the new keyword. So in this case, I'm creating a new city, passing in some data, and I'm calling the new object Sacramento. And so that's right here. And when I log out Sacramento.state, the this.state is bound to Sacramento because it was created with the new keyword, and we get the response, which is CA. And then finally, we have window binding. And window binding, the fourth type of binding here of this, is almost always a mistake when you're doing this. Window binding is what happens by default when no object is specified as a context, and this defaults to the window object when it's run in a browser. The window object is the object that represents the browser window. Generally, you should never assign properties directly to the window object. This is global scope and all the problems that are associated with that. But sometimes people will forget to bind their functions, and they'll do something like this, where we have log name and passed in author, but forgot to put in call or apply. So that's going to look for author on the window object. And if I try to run that here in the editor, it will give me undefined. But if you were to assign a window.author, which I can't do in the editor here because window's not defined in my editor because it's a browser property, but that would actually define a new property on the window object called author, and then you could run this, which would actually produce the value you think it should. But much more often what you'll see is you'll be running a function in React or Angular or something, and you keep getting undefined, but you know that you shouldn't be getting undefined, but the reason is that you haven't bound it to an object or to your component or your class. And so that is everything I want to say about binding. Another function that's been a part of JavaScript for a long time is array.map, and it creates a new array with the result of calling a provided function on every element in this array. There are 3 parameters that are automatically passed to the callback when you use map. The current value, so the current element that's being processed, the index, so it's the number of the element that you're currently operating on, and then the array that you're calling it on. So here's an example of how to use map. And map, again, is one of those things that's used everywhere in new JavaScript frameworks, and it's really, really handy to know. So here I have my favorite foods array from a little bit earlier, and I'm applying map to it to pass the elements of favorite foods into this function one by one, and then assign the result to a new array. So if I log that out, then here's my new array built from running this function on each element. Okay. So now I'm going to get into some of my favorite and the most widely used new capabilities of JavaScript. And I'm going to try to get through as many as I can here, and hopefully get up to what we're looking at coming out in 2018 as well, and some of the new things that are on the horizon that you'll be able to take advantage of. So starting with the most game-changing thing in ES6 is probably the ability to have block-scoped variables and constants. So constantlet are new ways to create variables in JavaScript, and these are in addition to the old function-scoped var keyword, but I would say that now there's probably no reason to use var anymore, and I would advise you not to. There are some people who even go as far as to just make all of their variables be const by default and then change them to let when they get errors. I don't know if you need to go that far, but here's an example of using var versus let. So in this case, we're creating 2 variables, a and b, and then we have an if statement where we're saying if a is equal to 5, then do these 2 statements. when you're using var, remember that it's function scoped, and since these aren't part of a function, oops, these are essentially globals. And so doing this, var a and var b, actually overwrites the original variables. And so you can see now a is equal to 4 and b is equal to 1. With let, let is block scope. So when you do a new variable called a2 and one called b2 here, and then inside of a block you set a2 is equal to 4, b2 is equal to 1, you're actually creating new variables here. So these variables don't have anything to do with these variables. And so when you log out the values of a2 and b2 outside of that block, now you have this original scope here, and then in here you can do console log a2, and the result of that is going to be 4. Okay. Constants, you can create a constant and then you can't give it a new value. So when I try to change my const to a new value, it says I'm trying to assign to a constant variable. And so that's that. And again, here's that difference between var and let. Arrow functions are a new function shorthand in JavaScript, and this allows you to write functions without having to use all that extra baggage. And these are really handy for just simple inline functions. And they also have a special property of sharing the same lexical this as the surrounding code. And I'm going to show you what that means and what the implications of that are in a moment. But one of the things that people really like about arrow functions are their more expressive closure syntax. So here, if you look at the bottom one in ES5, in the way I showed you earlier to use the map function, you're actually writing a full function definition there with all of the keywords and parentheses and curly braces and everything. With ES6, you can take numerous shortcuts to shorten this to just v arrow v plus 1. And so what's happening there is you can eliminate the parentheses around the parameters if there's only one parameter, and you can eliminate the return statement if all the function is doing is returning something. So that top one there, v arrow v plus 1, is just a really handy shortcut. So yeah, arrow functions have a more intuitive handling of current object context. In ES5, it would be very common to see code written like this, where you're taking, if you want to use the this inside of a function that's an inner function, you'd have to assign it to a different variable and then use that variable inside of the inner function. In ES6, you can just use an arrow function. And let me show you a demo. So I have this function here, counter, which has a property this.num equal to 1. And then we have an inner function of counter that increments this. It increments this.num. But because I'm using the function keyword here, when I log this out, I get not a number because the function keyword creates its own scope. Arrow functions don't create their own scope. So here we have another inner function called add arrow, which uses an arrow function and then increments this.num. When I log this out, I get inner arrow is equal to 1. And here's where I created the new counter, and then this is just logging out the final value after the new object is created. ES6 has default parameter handling, so you can actually give default values inside of the parameter list. In ES5, you would have to test whether a parameter is undefined, and if so, then you can give it a default value. In ES6, we just have the ability to do that right there. So here, if we're calling this default params function, we pass in one argument. That argument becomes x. And then the other ones that weren't passed in get their own default values. And then the console log statement proceeds like that. The rest parameter is a handy way of aggregating remaining arguments into a single parameter. So you can think of it as bundling together the rest of the arguments, as in this case here, where we have a function that's defined as having x, y, and then a rest parameter a. And then we have it returns x plus y, and then the length of a. So if we call that function passing in 1, 2, hello, true, 7, then the last three arguments there get bundled into a single array. And you can see that happening right here. We log it out and the result is 9 because it's 1 plus 2 times the length of this array, which is 3. Spread operator is kind of the opposite of the rest operator, and it spreads the elements of an iterable collection like an array or string. And so here we have the params, which is an array, and then other, which is an array made of 2 elements and then params spread out. So the result of other is going to be 1, 2, and then hello, true, 7. And so there is what other looks like. And spread operator can also be used for strings. So here's an example of using the spread operator to spread out the characters in a string into elements in an array. I think we're doing okay on time here. Template literals are a way of inserting properties into a string. So in this example, we have 2 objects. I'll go back to here. We have an object called customer, and really I'm using var here, but I should take my own advice and use let. And we have an order object here with 3 properties. And then we have a string called message, which is taking properties from these objects and inserting into the string. To use this template literal, you need to use backticks here. That's not a single quote, that's the backtick. That's in the far upper left corner of your keyboard. And then that builds the string into, right here, a string that combines the text with the properties. ES6 also has a new shorter syntax for properties with the same name and value. So if you have a property that has the same name and value, you can just use the value in ES6. And it also has computed names and object property definitions. And this one's kind of cool. I'm going to demo this on the web here. And so here in this case, we have a function called getOrderNum, which just increments our order num variable here. And then we have an object that uses computed object property names to combine the word order with the result of calling the function to give you a new property name for each property in the side of this object, just like that. Method notation is something that's used extensively in new JavaScript frameworks. You'll see this written as the code on the left here, where you just use the name of the method and then the parameter list and then the curly braces, rather than having to have a name and value as you do in previous versions of JavaScript. And this is just an easier syntax of doing the same thing. A lot of these changes to JavaScript are just better or simpler, or things that are more familiar to Java developers in particular. Array matching allows you to destructure arrays into individual variables. So here we have an array called list, and we want to create variables from that list. So we can use the square brackets here to create two new variables, A and B, from the items inside of that array. And again, you can see that happening right here, where we have A, B, and C being created, and in this case, it's from an object, so it works with objects as well. And here, yeah, here's the object matching. Class definition is one of the most visible changes that was made in ES6. It introduces a more object-oriented programming style of doing classes. Remember, though, that classes in JavaScript is a keyword rather than actually an implementation of classical object-oriented classes. So you're still using prototypes, but you're doing so in a language that's more familiar. And here's the class declaration. You have the class keyword, and then you have an optional constructor. And the constructor will be called when an instance of the class is created to set those values. Classes can be unnamed and just assigned to a variable, as in that first case, or they can be named by just putting the name after the class keyword. Here's how class inheritance works. You can use the extends keyword, and then you can use constructor to create classes based on other classes. I'm not going to talk a lot about symbol primitives. This is kind of a difficult concept to grasp. In short, it's a unique and immutable data type that can be used as an identifier for object properties. There are some well-known symbols, such as symbol iterator, and these are used to do things like generator functions and custom iterators. There is actually a really good class video here on Wintellect now. Eric Green talks about symbols, generators, and iterators in JavaScript. This is about an hour-long course. I would really recommend taking a look at this one. It's definitely worth your time to really understand how symbols, generators, and iterators work, and it's beyond the scope of the rest of this class, this webinar. Let's see, I want to get to promises, which are now built into ES6. They're an abstraction for asynchronous programming, alternative to callbacks. They can only succeed or fail once, and you can react to it any time. So I'm going to show some examples of a promise. So basically, once you create a function that returns a promise, you can call that function and then use the then keyword to do something once that function is finished. So it's a way of doing asynchronous code without having to nest callbacks inside of callbacks, which is in the Node.js world referred to as callback hell. Finally, in ES6, we got modules. And modules were something that we've been faking in JavaScript for a long time, and there have been different libraries created for doing modules, but now ES6 has its own built-in module system. And it's really cool. It uses just import and export, and you can export something using either a named export or a default export, and then you can import it into another file and you can use it inside that file. And this is something that we've been wanting and needing for a long time. Finally, we've got it. So now I want to talk about what's happened since ES6 and then what's happening this year. So in ES 2016, we got array includes, and this one will return a Boolean. It returns true if the value that you pass into it is an element in the array. Otherwise, it returns false. We got the exponentiation operator, and very simply, this just raises something to the power that's after the double asterisk. And that was actually about it for 2016. I think by the time 2016 came around, people needed a little bit of break from learning new things. But in ES 2017, we got an amazing and awesome new feature, async functions. And async functions allow you to defer the execution of code using the await statement. I'm going to show a few little demos about this because I think it's a really great feature, and if you're not using these now, you should be in the future. Async functions return a promise. If the function throws an error, the promise will be rejected. If the function returns a value, the promise will be resolved. So writing an async function is really simple. You just need to add the async keyword before the function word. And then you can use the await expression with that function. And await pauses the async function and waits for the promise to resolve prior to moving on. And what this gives you is a more synchronous way of writing asynchronous code. So I'm going to show you a demo of using promises, and then we're going to go into how to rewrite that using async await. So here's my promise demo. We have a function that returns a promise that doubles a number passed into it after 2 seconds. So we have this set timeout, and this is going to accept a value, return a promise after a period of 2 seconds with x times 2. And so when you run this, I'll reload it. It waits 2 seconds and then returns the result. And so that's simple enough. But what if you wanted to nest these? What if you wanted to have multiple things happen and have them all be asynchronous? So one thing will happen, another thing happen, and another thing happen. This is what we call a promise chain. And so here's an example of a promise chain. We have the same double after 2 seconds function, and now we're using this add promise function to return a promise that's going to double after 2 seconds, the number 10, and then double the number 20 after 2 seconds, and then double the number 30 after 2 seconds, and then add these together. And you can see it's starting to get a little bit messy here, a little bit confusing as to what's actually going on. But we're calling this add promise function, passing in 10, and then we're writing out the result. So if I reload this, it's going to do its thing, and then after a number of seconds, it's going to return the result and print it out to the console. With async await, you can rewrite this whole thing as this. So it looks like very synchronous code where we have our async function, which is going to run double after 2 seconds, passing in 10, and then double after 2 seconds, passing in 20, and then double after 2 seconds, passing in 30. And each time it's going to await the response, and then it's going to return the value, and then I log it out. But the great thing about async await is that it writes promises in this new syntax. It's very, very easy to read, and that looks like synchronous code, but it's actually async code. So that is that. In 2017, we also got object values. So this is a more declarative way of executing a for-of loop. So you can see here we have an object, and we use object values, and then it returns an array. Object entries returns an array with the key and value in subarrays. So if we pass in this object, then it returns a big array to us with sub entries inside of it. We also got the ability to have trailing commas and function parameter lists. So this is just that comma there would return an error previously. In parameter lists in 2017, it doesn't. String padding allows you to use pad start and pad end to just insert characters before or after a string. So in this case, if you do pad start 10, then it's going to take that ABC string you passed into it and pad it out until it's 10 characters long. So it inserts 7 spaces here. You can also pass in strings to pad with. So here we're saying pad with foo at the beginning until it's 10 characters long. And then pad end does the opposite. Here we're saying pad the end until it's 10 characters long, and pad the end with foo until it's 10 characters long. This year, we're getting object rest spread properties, which is the same as the rest spread properties we looked at before, but on objects. So it's collecting the remaining properties into a new object. So you can see here we have a new object input, and then we're saying const x, y, z, which is giving us a new object from here, collecting the remaining ones into z here. So there's our new rest object. Object spread spreads out the properties in an object. So we can have object 1 become part of object 2 very easily here by using the object spread. And now object 2 contains all the properties from both object 1 and object 2. And this is super handy in React, in anywhere where you're dealing with merging objects together, as you can see here. And then finally, we got promise prototype finally, which gives you a registers a callback to be invoked when a promise is settled. And so that kind of completes the implementation of promise in JavaScript. 2019, oh yeah, that's this year. 2019 has array flat map, which works like array map, but flat map returns an array of values. And we have array.flat, which flattens nested array and removes array holes. We also have object.fromEntries, which creates an object from key value pairs, like that. So I know that was quite a bit, but did manage to get through all the features I wanted to talk about. There's a lot more to learn about all of these things, and you can go way further in depth on a lot of this, and a lot of it is just a matter of using these things and getting some practice with them. However, it brings us to the end of this webinar, but remember we have, as attendees of this webinar, You're eligible for some special offers. In particular, we're offering 10% discount on any public, virtual Microsoft Online courses. And you can see our catalog at wintellect.com/MOC. And we're also offering a discount on training related to the new Microsoft role-based certifications. We have a new app dev briefing or Q&A that you can schedule with us, and you can get a $99 certification exam voucher and a 10% discount for private on-site training. And if you're interested in any of these, please reach out to Martha Guerin at this email address, and she will follow up with you. I have like 3 minutes here. I'm going to see if I can get to some of these questions. Let's see. The demo.js, is it available to play with? I can post this to my GitHub repo. That would be at github.com/ my username is Chris Minnick. So if you go to github.com/Chris Minnick, I will post this as JavaScript demo file or something like that, probably within the next 45 minutes. And then great question. Why are some of the names, the new features in JavaScript not consistent with widely accepted terms? In some cases, it's because the widely accepted terms conflict with other keywords in JavaScript. In other cases, it's because it's just wasn't implemented exactly the same in JavaScript as in other languages, and so they chose not to use the same names in order to avoid confusion. Let's see. What's the best source to go read about all the new syntax in one place? I would say the best source would be the Mozilla Developer Network. Mozilla has amazing documentation, and you can go to MDN web docs here, developer.mozilla.org, and in here you can read about everything, every technology, all this stuff, and you can get some great documentation and examples for all of it as well. And so with that, that brings us to the end of our presentation. It's 12 o'clock. I want to thank you all very much for coming, and I hope that you found it very useful. And I look forward to seeing you at my next one, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, which will be on the topic of Vue.js. Thank you very much.